California's skyline glittered in the evening light, but no building shone brighter than the Vance Global headquarters, a glass and steel monument that mirrored the man who owned it, unyielding, immaculate, and impossibly high. Alexander Vance, 35, was not merely successful. He was the embodiment of dominance in the corporate world. 7 companies bore his name, each in a different industry: technology, real estate, fashion, aviation, finance, media, and international shipping. Together, they formed an empire few could rival. He didn't inherit this power. He built it brick by ruthless brick after his parents' sudden death left him as the eldest of 8 siblings. At 21, he became not only a businessman but also a guardian, protector, and reluctant patriarch. Responsibility had hardened him. By necessity, he became a man who could not afford softness. His siblings saw him as a provider, his employees saw him as a commander, and his competitors saw him as an unstoppable force. The press called him the dictator in a suit. Behind closed doors, the nickname wasn't far from the truth. Alexander demanded perfection, tolerated no mistakes, and dismissed anyone who could not keep pace with his relentless schedule. His mornings began before sunrise, scanning reports while his black coffee cooled untouched. Lunch was a myth. Meetings consumed the hours. His nights often ended in the dim glow of his office, signing contracts worth millions without a flicker of emotion. Love, romance. They were words from a language he had forgotten. Women, when they appeared in his life, were temporary companions at charity galas or business dinners. He offered them diamonds and fine wine, but never a piece of himself. His time was currency, and no one could afford it. Yet, there was a loneliness he would never admit. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between conference calls, he would catch himself staring out his office window, wondering what it might feel like to live a simpler life, one without the constant pressure to win, dominate, and control. But the thought would vanish as quickly as it came. On a late autumn evening, as he reviewed the quarterly performance of his aviation company, his assistant entered the office with a folder and a hesitant tone. "Mr. Vance, the board in Dubai has confirmed the meeting next week. They've arranged a private jet, but," she hesitated, "the weather is unpredictable. Commercial might be safer." Alexander's brow furrowed. He disliked commercial flights, the lack of control, the crowds, but the Dubai deal was crucial. After a moment, he said flatly, "Book it. First class. Emirates." He didn't know it yet, but that single decision, a mere shift from private to public, would set in motion an encounter capable of dismantling the fortress he had built around his heart. For now, though, he was still Alexander Vance, the untouchable king of 7 empires, unaware that high above the clouds, a graceful stranger would soon make him question everything he thought he knew about power, control, and love. The day of the flight to Dubai began like any other for Alexander Vance, precise, efficient, and without wasted motion. His chauffeur dropped him at Los Angeles International Airport just in time to avoid unnecessary waiting. He disliked airports. They were noisy, unpredictable, and filled with strangers. Yet today, he tolerated it. The Dubai deal was too important, and the first-class Emirates ticket guaranteed a degree of privacy. Inside the luxurious cabin, Alexander settled into his seat with his usual detachment. The soft lighting reflected off the polished wood paneling, the air faintly scented with vanilla and fresh linen. He opened his laptop, ready to bury himself in financial projections before takeoff. Then she appeared. Walking down the aisle with effortless poise was a woman in the iconic red Emirates hat and cream uniform. Her dark hair was neatly tucked, her skin radiant under the cabin lights, and her eyes, warm, attentive, swept over the passengers not with mechanical politeness, but genuine interest. Emily Carter had been a senior flight attendant for 6 years. She had served celebrities, politicians, and billionaires, but her composure never faltered. She noticed everything: the nervous tapping of a passenger's fingers, the subtle sigh of someone uncomfortable in their seat. Her job wasn't simply to serve, it was to anticipate needs before they were spoken. When she reached Alexander's row, she offered a soft, professional smile. "Good afternoon, sir. Would you like a hot towel before we depart?" Alexander looked up from his laptop, his sharp blue eyes locking with hers for a fraction of a second. Something unfamiliar stirred inside him, not attraction alone, but curiosity. Still, his response was clipped. "Yes. Thank you." Her movements were precise, yet graceful, as she handed him the towel. He noticed the slight warmth of her fingertips as they brushed his hand, a fleeting touch that shouldn't have meant anything, but it lingered. As the flight progressed, turbulence struck over the Pacific. Passengers tensed, a few gasped. Emily's calm voice came over the intercom, her tone steady and reassuring. Moving through the cabin, she crouched to speak to an elderly couple, then offered water to a crying child. Even Alexander, a man immune to chaos, found himself watching her with something close to admiration. When she returned to his seat to serve coffee, she noticed his gaze. "Would you like it black, sir?" "Yes," he replied, then hesitated. "You seem very good at your job." A faint smile touched her lips. "Thank you. I just try to make people feel safe." The words echoed in his mind long after she moved on. Safe, a concept foreign to him, yet somehow tied to her presence. By the time the aircraft touched down in Dubai, Alexander was unsettled. Not because of the turbulence, but because for the first time in years, someone had entered his awareness without his permission. But Emily Carter, ever the professional, simply wished him a pleasant stay, then disappeared into the flow of passengers, leaving him with a distinct and irritating urge to see her again. For most men, chance encounters faded into memory. For Alexander Vance, they became missions. Back in California, he found himself replaying fragments of the flight in his mind. The sound of Emily Carter's voice, the measured calm in her eyes, the way she made complete strangers feel safe. It was unsettling. He wasn't accustomed to thinking about a woman after she left the room, let alone after an entire ocean lay between them. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more. But that curiosity led him to make a few discreet inquiries through his aviation company's contacts. It didn't take long to learn her full name, her seniority with Emirates, and, most importantly, her upcoming flight schedules. Alexander booked a business trip to Singapore that just happened to coincide with one of Emily's routes. His assistant raised an eyebrow at the sudden change of plans but said nothing. When he boarded that flight weeks later, he spotted her almost immediately. She was speaking softly to a young mother juggling a restless toddler. Emily didn't notice him at first, and he took the opportunity to observe. Her poise was the same as before, but now he saw the subtle strength beneath it, a discipline forged from years of dealing with demanding passengers and unpredictable situations. When she finally approached his seat, recognition flickered in her eyes. "Mr. Vance," she said politely, "welcome aboard." "You remember me," he replied, allowing a rare hint of a smile. "I try to remember all my passengers." Her tone was light, but her guarded expression suggested she knew men like him, powerful, used to getting what they wanted. The hours passed, and he looked for excuses to speak to her. A question about the wine list. A comment on the smoothness of the flight. She responded with warmth, but always from a professional distance. It was during the layover in Singapore that the first shadow appeared. A man in an impeccable navy suit, with perfectly combed dark hair and an easy smile, approached Emily in the hotel lobby. Alexander, who was coincidentally passing through on his way to a meeting, caught part of their conversation. "Emily," the man said with a familiarity that grated on Alexander's nerves, "you still look incredible. We should have dinner before your next flight." Her polite smile was tinged with discomfort. "Hello, Richard. I'm busy this trip." Richard Hale. Alexander recognized the name instantly. Senior executive at an international airline, known for his charm and ambition. And, if rumor was to be believed, equally known for the way he discarded people once they no longer served his goals. Richard's gaze flicked toward Alexander, measuring him like a rival. "Friend of yours?" he asked Emily. "Just a passenger," she replied quickly. Alexander said nothing. But in that moment, he knew two things. First, Richard had history with Emily, history that might complicate everything. Second, Alexander Vance didn't lose. Not in business, not in life, and certainly not when it came to something, or someone, he wanted. The chase had officially begun. The next time Alexander and Emily crossed paths, it was purely by design, at least on his part. Another business trip appeared suddenly on his calendar, this time from New York to Dubai. His assistant didn't question it anymore. She had learned that when her boss wanted something, the reason was irrelevant. When he boarded the aircraft, Emily was already greeting passengers. Her eyes met his, and for the briefest moment, Surprise flickered there before she regained her composure. "Mr. Vance," she greeted with a professional nod. "Welcome back." "Thank you," he replied, his voice lower, almost softer than before. "Seems fate likes putting us on the same flights." "Or careful planning," she said, one eyebrow lifting just enough to make her point. The first hours passed in the usual rhythm of long-haul travel. Alexander worked on his laptop, but his focus wavered. Every time Emily moved through the aisle, his gaze followed unconsciously. He told himself it was simply curiosity about her poise, her discipline, but deep down, he knew it was something far more dangerous. Midway through the flight, turbulence rattled the cabin again. Alexander watched as Emily crouched to reassure a nervous teenage boy traveling alone. She didn't just say, "You'll be fine." She asked about his destination, what he wanted to see in Dubai, even offered to check on him every hour. Her attention wasn't rehearsed, it was real. Later, when she came by with the dinner service, Alexander surprised her by asking, "Do you ever get tired of people?" She blinked, then smiled faintly. "Sometimes. But I've learned that everyone has a reason for the way they are. Even the difficult ones." "Even me?" he asked. Emily's smile widened, though it carried a trace of challenge. "Especially you." For a man used to deference, her honesty was both irritating and intoxicating. After the meal service, when most passengers were dozing, she stopped by his seat with a cup of tea. "Something different for you," she said. "You look like you could use a break from coffee." Alexander studied her. "You notice a lot, don't you?" "It's part of the job," she replied. Then, after a pause, "But I think in your case, it's more than work. You carry something heavy, Mr. Vance. And you don't put it down." He didn't answer right away. No one, not his executives, not his siblings, spoke to him like this. "After my parents died," he said finally, "I didn't have a choice. If I stopped moving forward, everything would fall apart." Emily's gaze softened. "A life without warmth isn't living, you know." Her words stayed with him for the rest of the flight. Long after they landed in Dubai, Alexander found himself thinking less about the deals waiting for him, and more about a flight attendant who saw through the armor he had worn for 14 years, and dared to tell him it wasn't enough. Richard Hale had never liked losing, not in business, not in love. When he saw Alexander Vance's growing interest in Emily, something ugly sparked inside him. It wasn't just jealousy, it was a matter of pride. He had known Emily for years, once convinced she'd be part of his future. But she'd walked away from him, and Richard had never forgiven her for that. He began subtly, a passing remark to a mutual colleague about Alexander's aggressive business style. A carefully timed phone call to Emily, dropping hints about lawsuits and corporate scandals. "Men like Alexander Vance," Richard said smoothly one evening when Emily answered, "will tell you whatever you want to hear. They're built to win, Emily, and that means people like us are just pieces on their board." Emily listened but didn't respond. She knew Richard's tendency to twist truth into something darker, yet his words lingered in her mind. The real blow came in Dubai. Alexander had arranged to meet Emily for dinner at a quiet rooftop restaurant overlooking the marina. It was meant to be the first time they'd spend an evening together outside of an airplane cabin. No uniforms, no interruptions, just conversation. But hours before their dinner, Alexander's phone lit up with an urgent call from his CFO. One of his companies, the media arm of Vance Global, was under sudden attack. A hostile takeover bid had been launched, and his legal team was already in crisis mode. He couldn't ignore it. The entire empire could be destabilized if he did. He canceled the dinner with a short message. "Can't make it. Business emergency." No explanation, no apology. Emily sat at the restaurant for 30 minutes, unsure whether to be hurt or understanding. That's when Richard appeared. "Well," Richard said, sliding into the empty seat across from her, "I guess I'm not surprised. Alexander's first love has always been himself, and maybe his bank account." She frowned. "It's just business. He's a CEO. Things happen." "Emily," Richard leaned forward, lowering his voice, "you're not naive. Men like him don't have emergencies. They have priorities. And you'll never be one of them." His words burrowed deeper than she wanted to admit. Alexander had been vague. And wasn't this exactly the kind of behavior she'd promised herself she wouldn't tolerate, being treated as an afterthought? Meanwhile, across the city, Alexander was fighting a war in a boardroom. Hours of negotiations, emergency calls, and financial maneuvering kept him locked away until nearly dawn. The deal was stabilized, but the cost was high, not just in money, but in something he didn't yet realize. By the time he checked his phone the next morning, Emily's polite message, "Hope everything is fine," felt colder than the air-conditioned suite around him. For a man who had always believed he could control outcomes, Alexander was beginning to sense he was losing the one thing he truly wanted, and this time, no amount of power or money could fix it overnight. For days after the missed dinner, Alexander felt the quiet distance between him and Emily. Her replies to his messages were shorter, her tone more formal, as if she were slowly retreating behind an invisible wall. He hated the feeling. He'd faced hostile mergers, government investigations, and billion-dollar crises without flinching. Yet the possibility of losing her left a tightness in his chest that no business problem ever had. For the first time in his life, Alexander realized that winning her trust required something no contract or negotiation could buy. He couldn't command her affection. He had to earn it. So he did something extraordinary, for him at least. He canceled 2 board meetings, postponed a deal in Hong Kong, and booked a seat on Emily's next long-haul flight to Paris. But not in first class. When Emily boarded the aircraft, she didn't spot him immediately. He was seated in economy, dressed simply in a navy sweater and dark jeans, without the sharp lines of his tailored suits or the intimidating aura of a CEO. He blended in like any other passenger. It wasn't until mid-flight, when turbulence slowed the meal service, that she noticed him standing in the aisle, helping another flight attendant pass trays to passengers. Emily's brows knitted in confusion. "Mr. Vance, what are you doing?" "Helping," he said simply, handing a meal to a teenager in the next row. "Figured you could use an extra pair of hands." He wasn't graceful. He spilled a water cup, dropped a bread roll, and nearly tripped over the beverage cart, but the passengers laughed, and Emily couldn't deny the warmth in her chest watching him try. Later, when the cabin lights dimmed and most passengers were asleep, Alexander found her near the galley. His voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. "I've spent my entire life building things, companies, wealth, reputation. But none of it matters when I think about losing the chance to know you." Emily hesitated, her guard still half raised. "Alexander, you live in a world where everything is calculated. How do I know this isn't just another move in a game you're playing?" He shook his head. "Because in business, I negotiate for advantage. With you, I'd give up advantage entirely. I'd give up half of what I own if it meant you'd believe me." She searched his eyes, looking for the cold strategist she had met on that first flight. But what she saw instead was a man stripped of his armor, still strong, but no longer hiding behind it. When they landed in Paris, he didn't try to push her for an answer. Instead, he walked her to the crew exit and simply said, "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." It wasn't grand in the way most people imagined. No fireworks, no public spectacle. But for Alexander Vance, a man who had never bent for anyone, it was the greatest gesture he had ever made. Richard Hale wasn't finished. When news of Alexander's trip to Paris reached him, and the fact that he had been seen with Emily, Richard decided to make his last move. He called Emily during her layover, his tone dripping with urgency. "Emily, you're making a mistake," Richard said. "I've known Alexander's type for years. This sudden interest, it won't last. Once he gets what he wants, you'll be a memory." This time, Emily didn't let his words settle. "Funny," she replied. "You've had years to show me you're different, but all you've done is try to tear someone else down." She ended the call before he could respond. Richard's influence began to crumble after that. A few of his own questionable deals surfaced in the media, and while Alexander had nothing to do with the leak, he didn't lift a finger to save him either. Richard had made his bed. Now he lay in it. Meanwhile, Alexander kept his promise. He didn't push, didn't chase too aggressively. He simply stayed present. Sometimes it was a message wishing her a safe flight, sometimes an invitation to coffee during her layovers. Small gestures, but consistent. One evening, during a rare break in her schedule, Emily found herself in Los Angeles. Alexander invited her to dinner at a quiet coastal restaurant. This time, he arrived early, waiting on the terrace as the Pacific waves rolled in under a golden sunset. When she joined him, there was no tension in her posture, no guarded expression, just calm. Over the meal, they spoke about everything except business. Childhood memories, favorite cities, the books they kept returning to. After dessert, Alexander leaned back, studying her with that same sharp gaze she had once found intimidating. But now, there was softness in it. "I've been thinking," he began, "about the word you used on our first flight together. Safe. I've never been that for anyone. But I want to be, Emily. For you." She smiled, not the polite curve of a flight attendant's lips, but something warmer. "You already are. You just didn't realize it." The months that followed were quiet, but steady. They saw each other whenever their schedules allowed, until finally, on a breezy California afternoon, Alexander asked her to marry him. There was no audience, no press release, just the two of them on a cliffside overlooking the ocean. At their wedding, held on a private stretch of beach, his 7 siblings stood by his side. For once, the toasts weren't about his empires or his success. They were about the man who had finally learned that winning wasn't about control. It was about giving someone the freedom to walk away, and trusting they'd choose to stay. Emily still flew for Emirates, her independence intact, while Alexander learned to take days off without guilt. He still had 7 companies and 7 siblings, but now he had something far rarer, a home in the heart of one woman. And as they danced under the fading California sun, Alexander knew this was the one victory he would never stop cherishing.